John, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Really great to be here and looking forward to today's conversation.
We're talking about global marketing from APAC. I know Airwallex is operating across 130 plus markets, right? And it's very rare to see an organization based in this part of the world having the marketing function really working across all the other regions. So, can you first of all paint a little bit of picture of how the marketing function at Airwallex works, especially since it's based in APAC and operating in so many different markets?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's off the bat, it's not the easiest to kind of construct an architect, and you certainly do need the right people. And I can talk a bit about that later on as well. Marketing at Airwallex is one of the newer functions at the company. It's not to say that the company didn't have marketers before, but really over the past 2.5 years or so, we really tried to architect a more kind of modern day marketing org that can really help us through global scale and expansion. Airwallex, by the products that we offer and by our own kind of DNA and ethos, kind of inherently global. So we cater to a global audience base, we cater to global entrepreneurs, and we have globally oriented products, and we ourselves are global in how we're set up, right? And so it's not even that foreign for us to actually think about building the marketing function from within APAC. But the way things are set up, we largely started building around core capabilities. And so if you kind of abstract away all the kind of complexity, marketing fundamentally, you're trying to do two things. You're trying to build a brand, awareness, familiarity, credibility, etc. And you're trying to build a business. And that's essentially repeatable and predictable revenue for the org. You never want to be a cost item. You want to be a revenue or a strategic driver for the business, right? And so you really kind of have to make sure you're doing either of those things and ideally both of those things. And they tend to reinforce each other. And so to do that, though, location matters to some extent, but fundamentally, it's more about capabilities instead, right? Do you have the right product marketing? How do you think about go-to-market growth or field or partner? And so it's really not so much been about location, it's more been about first principles of those capabilities.
How was the decision made, and it probably was maybe a little bit before your time at Airwallex, to not establish the marketing function in North America, somewhere like that? Because that tends to happen quite often, especially the Aussie companies. It's like the not the first thing, but one of the early things that they do is set up an office in the US and then start to hire there. And the marketing function especially tends to sit there. How was it that in this case, the decision was made?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, I think from a history standpoint, Airwallex proudly founded in Melbourne, 10 years ago, right? And started off from essentially a coffee shop and has now morphed into one of the fastest growing fintechs in the world. So quite a startup pivot in and of itself. But I think that the decision, when you think about Airwallex's kind of overall kind of leadership team structure and where kind of centers of gravity are, we're quite geographically dispersed, right? And so there isn't really the concept of having every member of the exec team or every member or one particular function concentrated in a particular market. And right now, I mean, Singapore is our headquarters, and so we've kind of oriented a lot of our global teams around Singapore. But that said, we still need, especially as we scale across continental Europe, especially as we scale throughout the Americas, we still need to build up those regional teams as well. But I think, again, coming back to that first point around history, kind of really starting out in Melbourne and kind of scaling across APAC and now scaling globally, that heritage is quite important to us. I mean, second also is that, fundamentally, we are a challenger brand. We're a challenger company trying to disrupt, essentially decades, if not more than a century of kind of legacy systems, right? And so it's not uncommon for us to also be a little bit contrarian, right? In the sense that we don't necessarily want to just set up things the way that other companies do it for XYZ reasons. We like the fact that there's a certain dynamism that comes from APAC. We like the fact that there's a certain complexity that comes from APAC. And for example, the type of talent that you get when you hire in some APAC markets, folks that are inherently used to dealing with fragmentation. They're inherently used to dealing with global trade. Think about, many economies. You take a market again, or an economy like Singapore, you take Hong Kong. A lot of these economies have businesses that are global from day one because that's existential. And for a company that really cares so much about global infrastructure, global trade, global software, global business, empowering global entrepreneurs, it's actually a benefit when you start to actually locate in APAC, because that fundamentally is a part of the APAC DNA in many ways.
Maybe let's unpack a little bit more
Yeah.
about what does the marketing and structure look like at Airwallex? You're based in Singapore. How does that? How have you built the team around yourself and around the marketing function?
Yeah, I mean, we try and maintain a fairly flat structure, and I think that's quite important as well because again, when you're so spread out across, you need structure, yes, but you also need to make sure that information flows fairly freely and you kind of de-risk yourself of unnecessary bureaucracy. And so I think
Mm,
there's certain first principles that go in around kind of maintaining more of a flat structure, also kind of maintaining more of this kind of matrix model and so oriented around core capabilities. And so, as we started assembling the building blocks for marketing, I think one of the mistakes that I've oftentimes observed across my career and also observing other marketing teams, talking to other marketers is that, product marketing is one of the areas which oftentimes gets underinvested in. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes folks make because it's a
mm,
typical pattern where, companies get funding, they start to see some growth, and then they immediately start to pump in a bunch of money into performance marketing and they start to hire a bunch of growth marketers. Not bad and not illogical, but for you to actually get to scale properly, unless you have product marketing right, unless you have the value prop, the positioning, the segmentation, it doesn't matter how good your distribution is. It doesn't matter how good your growth team is. Because if your root is flawed, everything else after that is somewhat flawed. And so I think that was one of the first core decisions. How do you set up kind of a central product marketing capability? Then we start to build out the other core capabilities. What does growth look like at scale? How do we think about moving beyond performance marketing and unifying search engine optimization, lifecycle marketing? Then we start to think, what about our tech stack? So then we start to establish teams around marketing strategy and operations, our lead management flows. So do you have the right processes? We start to branch out even more. Partner ecosystem, new segments beyond kind of SMB enterprise. So when you have to start to think about the field capability, the partner marketing capability, and then brand being so critical, especially when you're trying to expand globally and trust is so important in financial services, then you start to think about how do you put a very deliberate approach to brand in place. And so we started essentially assembling these building blocks and we have these core capabilities at a central level, but then we also replicate those capabilities within each region. Because while we do want to be globally consistent, we need to be locally authentic. And that kind of
mm.
mix of global consistency with local authenticity is quite critical.
I love the locally authentic element of it. Just to give a little bit of a glance to listeners as well, a bit of context. Can you tell us a little bit about like what does a team look like, from a marketing perspective? How many geographies, how diverse it is, and can you give us a bit of a glimpse of that?
Yeah, so I mean, we're essentially spread out across all the major geos, right? And so we have the kind of bulk of the global team here in Singapore, but we also kind of hedge a bit. So we've kind of built out our product marketing capability more in San Francisco, and that's in part because that's where a lot of the great product marketing talent tends to be.
Mm,
Mainly also because a lot of the companies with kind of more built out product marketing teams, to your earlier point, traditionally will kind of build out in the West and then kind of scale, right? And so that's where
yeah.
we kind of found a bunch of the talent. But we're still, right now that that core team is established, now starting to kind of staff up in region. But we essentially have kind of core capabilities kind of built out in San Francisco. We have a corpus of folks here in Singapore and then London as well. And then we have regional teams across multiple markets. So Shanghai, Hong Kong, Melbourne, Sydney, London, Israel, dot, dot, dot. So essentially where we kind of have focus to really drive geographic expansion, and also where there's other kind of commercial gravity, that's where we also will co-locate marketing.
What are some of the unique challenges and maybe even advantages of operating out of this part of the world, having the HQ in this part of the world while running a global business?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be the challenge of just time zone, but to some extent, I discount that because you can essentially manage that with process, and it's not unique to APAC. I mean, time zone is just a problem if just any delta between where one set of people are and another set of people, right? So, but yes, you still have to kind of manage with a fairly distributed team, multiple time zones, and you have to make sure your communication is sound and you have the right process because not all information is going to be shared at the same time with everyone, or not all information everyone will be in the same room to digest. And so what are your async ways and norms of communicating? So making sure that you have very detailed norms around Slack communication, making sure you have very detailed memos people can comment, that way they can get their voice heard, and then decisions don't get made without the right people in the room. So I think one, yes, the challenge of being distributed is there from a practical standpoint, but we just have to be extra deliberate around communication norms. The other kind of challenge that I'm starting to observe more is every marketer's favorite topic, or every business person's favorite topic, seems to be AI. And so we are starting to see a lot of that AI innovation happening in Silicon Valley. And even for me as a marketer, I want to get my hands dirty. I want to get my hands kind of on the latest tech and have real world conversations with other entrepreneurs who are building these next gen tools. And there's just a certain kind of distance when, yes, you can get on a Zoom call with someone, but I'd rather just be in the same vicinity where I can just pop across to their office or vice versa. We can just get into the weeds of what they're building. And so I think there's a certain kind of organic in the trenches piece, which sometimes gets missed when you're kind of out of that immediate Silicon Valley orbit. But again, you just have to be extra deliberate about kind of mitigating that and making sure that, even with the teams you have on the ground in Silicon Valley, they're also the ones who are in the weeds and can then have the right communication mechanisms to kind of feedback.
What are you getting your hands dirty these days? What are some of the tools that are on your radar and you're really impressed with?
Yeah, we are we look at AI across a few different dimensions, but again, we also want to be deliberate because we don't want to just kind of jump on the bandwagon without making sure the tools that we adopt are actually adding value, right? So I think we kind of cut it across a few dimensions. One, in terms of just content generation, particularly around written content. We've just found tools like Writer, as an example, a really great platform to make sure there's consistency in our voice across geos, but also in terms of speeding up the briefing process, the editing process. And so I think that investment for us paid off in a matter of months, and probably, 4 or 5 months or so, just in terms of the efficiency gains, right? And so you have platforms like Writer, there are platforms like Jasper as well, which can also go end to end. Increasingly, I'm being more into tools that kind of track how your brand might be showing up on certain LLM platforms, tools like Profound, as an example, because I think what's really fascinating for me right now is we're in the midst of so many paradigm shifts, particularly in SEO. The same SEO playbook that folks have been trying to run for the past 15 years is not going to cut it anymore. Yeah. And it's an exciting time because, if you are late to the game trying to run the same playbook, you have so much catching up to do because there are other companies that have been, cranking out blogs and keywords for years. And if that's the name of the game and you're late, you're heavily disadvantaged. Whereas now there's a bit of a paradigm shift where, starting to think through proprietary content, starting to think through, communities, like getting information from Reddit, starting to think through more video content. And I think just understanding, how do you really equip yourself and equip your teams with that next gen SEO is just really fascinating, and tools, again, to help you understand how you're showing up right now and where the gap is vis-a-vis competition are quite useful. I mean, again, like SEO is fundamentally, if you extract away complexity, it's what are people searching for, where they're searching for it, and are you the people that are showing up and that are trusted? Right. And that's fundamentally it. And those dynamics are changing in today's world.
The reason I ask this question is we come across this quite often where, the promise AI is massive. There's all this efficiencies, but sometimes it's really hard to actually come across examples where it's like, oh, we did this and this is the outcome. And I feel like there's just so much noise.
But you know what's interesting with this kind of philosophically is that, and this is kind of a paradox, because let's say AI tools continue to kind of build out and, maybe there's this kind of Moore's law relationship where the pace of innovation is so exponential that really a lot of what's been sought after, let's say, gets realized, right? Teams are becoming incredibly more efficient. Essentially, the playing field gets leveled across businesses. So whether you're a mom and pop or whether you're a multinational, there's that kind of leveling of the playing field because things have become more efficient, right? What that then yields actually is an interesting question around where the differentiation comes in. Because if tools level the differentiation around distribution and production, then what starts to actually matter more starts to be the first principles, starts to be your storytelling, starts to be your positioning, starts to be that really kind of core of marketing, almost the kind of non-technical facets of marketing. And so it's really kind of paradoxical that as we get more technologically savvy, the parts that are going to really matter even more are the non-technical facets of marketing.
Tell me a little bit about that. Tell me, what are you changing or shifting at Airwallex to be able to work with that narrative?
Right now, I'm trying to put more people in the product marketing org. Going back to that previous point, I think many orgs underinvest in product marketing, and especially if you think about global scale and consistency. Again, going back to that whole global, consistent, locally authentic, there are kind of four key truths in any market, and I've kind of four key truths of marketing. There's a brand truth, there's a product truth, there's a market truth, and there's a user truth. Brand truth fundamentally is where you get the consistency. If I show, let's say, an Airwallex ad in Melbourne, I show an Airwallex ad in San Francisco or London, yes, they're going to be different, but fundamentally you should know it's from Airwallex because the brand kind of ethos is the same. So that brand truth is going to be consistent. Where you're going to get the variability actually is in the market truth, because every market will have different needs and kind of different kind of ways that they respond to the kind of macroeconomic environment. You're going to see variation on the user truth, because in certain markets, maybe it's a enterprise play, it's an SMB play in another market. Even within then, the types of SMBs or the types of verticals in enterprise might be different. And then there's going to be some product variation, because maybe your product suite is not the same in each market, or maybe it's used slightly differently. And I think that's really where that product marketing org comes into play, because they're helping calibrate where in the spectrum the truths are. And they also have to work very, very closely with the brand team to really also fuse everything together. And so I think in my mind, really investing in that core product marketing function is critical so that we again get that local storytelling and authenticity right.
Can you give a little bit of a indication of, when you're saying invest more in product marketing, what that means?
Yeah, so I mean, I think right now, for the record, I think we're underweight on product marketing at Airwallex. I don't think we have enough product marketers. At a minimum, I want to get that to around kind of 10% of the org. Right now, it's probably 5-ish or so. So I want to kind of double the team.
Yeah, right.
But it's also a matter of making sure that every single kind of major product suite is covered. So there's kind of a one-to-one mapping across product suites. There's geographic coverage right now, so that you don't necessarily have someone sitting in London trying to essentially articulate the Singapore story. So I want geographic coverage. And then I want essentially cross-functional coverage as well. So cross-functional coverage by industry. So let's say if travel is important, and we see travel as being an important vertical across multiple markets.
Right.
Then I want someone who's that industry expert, and then someone for kind of competitive, because the landscape is also changing so quickly. So I need that kind of complete holistic picture of product experts, kind of a market cut or a regional cut, industry cut, and a competitive cut. And we're just not there yet. And so that's what I'm trying to build towards.
And when you say 5 to 10%, are we talking about the total number of employees at Airwallex, or are you talking about the number of employees at marketing? Marketing. Okay, so 10% of the headcount going into product marketing. Very interesting. And also that divide across geographical, vertical, competitive, and then obviously HQ. Very interesting mix. Very heavy hitting team. So it sounds like it's going to get to.
If your core is strong, as even as a human being, then the rest tends to get strength from that.
I love it. I love that analogy. Tell me a little bit about brand, because Airwallex is doing some interesting things around brand. I mean, you are a B2B fintech, but you're sponsoring and collaborating with McLaren F1. Tell me a little bit about brand, and I want to then talk about the F1 sponsorship.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we zoom out a little bit, what's very important for us in the financial services is the aspect of trust, especially if you're in the financial services space. Because if you're a challenger brand here, you're going up against kind of legacy folks in the industry that have essentially been monetizing trust for over 100 years. Right? And so our job is to quickly close that trust gap, and to do so at a global level. So if you think about kind of ways to essentially deconstruct trust, I love this framework because I use it in my personal life as well. Trust is essentially reliability, credibility, and intimacy. All those have to be high, and then low self-orientation. I can't remember who actually came up with that framework, but I've heard it in so many different trainings. And it's useful because it doesn't matter if you're a B2B or a B2C fintech, you're still fundamentally selling to humans. I think in the B2B world, you so oftentimes hear, we're selling and we're marketing to business decision makers. No, you're marketing to humans who happen to make business decisions. And so it's still a human to human interaction. And if you think about how you build trust with a human, it comes down to those four aspects. So, particularly when it came to McLaren and sports sponsorships writ large, we see that as a very kind of strong and potent way to hit all those different facets. So for example, you take credibility. The fact that we're working with an entity like McLaren would suggest Airwallex is financially sound enough to sign a kind of a multi-year deal with a quite a reputable brand. It also suggests, if you look at the other partners that McLaren has, the likes of Google, Dell, Goldman Sachs, etc., that Airwallex is in that caliber as well as a tier one company. Instantly, it kind of signals to the market credibility. Then there's an aspect which we really wanted to make sure was a part of the arrangement. So when we do these deals, we want to be true partners, not just sponsors where we put on a logo. And so there's product integration. And so the fact that we can then say, we're helping to power McLaren's global financial operations, that is the reliability aspect right there. Because if we can do it for McLaren at this scale, believe me, we can do it for you, right? Then the intimacy piece comes into play. And that's where the really interesting marketing comes into play. Because it's not really about, our approach hasn't been, let's go, do some talking head videos and let's go make some, cheesy puns around, speed and, you see so much of that in the kind of F1 sponsorship world. For us, it was like, take a human layer and what do humans care about? If I run into a dinner party and I start talking to you about a white paper and financial infrastructure, it's probably going to be a fairly short conversation. You're probably going to try and immediately run to the restroom or something to exit yourself. If I start talking to you about sports, if I start talking about culture, art, then there starts to be more of that bond. I start to understand what interests you. And so our approach to the sponsorship has been weaving in art and culture and sports and technology, working with folks like Rico Rennie to tell that kind of local story and kind of fuse it with Oscar's story, fuse it with our story, and then bring that kind of intimacy to life. And then last but not least, a lot of the work that we'll do when we bring McLaren campaigns to life at races, like for example in Melbourne early in the year, there's usually an Airwallex for startups component as well. And that's really the low self orientation. It's like, we are here to honor and celebrate the people that we serve. And so, we have kind of grants, and the entrepreneurs who won these grants are just fantastic people. First Nations grant, VC grant was awarded as well, business acceleration grant, because it's just our way of saying, we are here to serve you. We appreciate what you do, and we're your partner to kind of help you do this. And so across that one sponsorship and execution, you're getting reliability, credibility, intimacy, and then that low self-orientation.
I mean, sponsorships like this, and in general, brand activities, tends to be a little bit hard when it comes to measurement. I'm keen to know how you go about kind of doing that at Airwallex. Is it based on trust and these four KPIs? Are there other KPIs that you have in place? How do you, or you might just say, we don't quantify brand, but how do you quantify brand?
Yeah, so I'll answer your question kind of directly and indirectly. So I'll answer your question indirectly first, which is kind of as a first principle, yes, data is important, but data should not override common sense. And I think sometimes that's where folks get tripped up. Like, if we fundamentally know we're a challenger brand entering a market, trying to get awareness fairly quickly and trying to kind of cut through the noise, even if I can't, quantify this down to the exact cent, there's a certain kind of rational and kind of logical argument, and particularly being that kind of risk-taking, responsible risk-taking kind of ethos on the team, we're willing to actually try this and learn from it, right? We will take a calculated risk and we'll kind of adjust the parameters to say, well, what's the positive upside and what's the potential negative upside? But like fundamentally, the data doesn't have to be fully there if there's enough kind of common sense and sound thinking. But specifically in terms of what we look at a few different areas. One, because we are banking on this relationship to do a lot for our kind of trust and awareness. We do our semi-annual RAND surveys. And so in each market, in terms of our target audience, we ask a variety of questions, kind of track our major kind of brand health metrics. And we started introducing kind of McLaren questions as well. Which companies do you associate McLaren with? How is it yielding kind of changes in terms of trust, in terms of consideration? In the last round, I think nearly 60% of the respondents said the McLaren sponsorship will make them trust Airwallex more, and roughly 70% said it'll make them more likely to choose Airwallex for their payment needs, right? And so we're starting to try and quantify that. Now that's kind of on the brand kind of metric side. Similarly, when it comes to overall business dollars per se, we also look at this from a pipeline perspective. So how much kind of pipeline is being sourced? How much pipeline is being accelerated? Is it opening up new conversations with kind of partners as well? And we actually have seen that. So we have seen even partners or conversations that have been taking months to potentially break through. Once you start to, again, connect with some of these folks at a human level and you start to kind of get them in the room and corporate hospitality as well, that starts to kind of open the doors. And so we are tracking also the pipeline impact and business impact. The third piece, which, was kind of surprising to me, but in reality should not have been. And, we don't necessarily track this, but it's been quite visible. It's just the impact it's had on employee sentiment, because especially when a Grand Prix rolls into a particular region where there's an office, the entire office gets behind it. And it's just this moment of pride. You're seeing your company, you're seeing, and your mom, your dad, your friends are seeing, Airwallex on, Oscar's overalls, Orlando's suit, the car, the execution that we're doing. There's just a sense of pride and upliftment. And so that piece has just been a really positive plus as well.
I love it. I love the point that you kind of brought up, where it's not everything can be measured, and there's a bit of common sense that need to be used when it comes to branding and brand activities. I think that's we've lost that for a little while, and it's slowly coming back in the B2B marketing with some of the new developments and it's happening, and some of the challenges with attribution and all that stuff.
Definitely. Well, hopefully that will that kind of mindset will kind of accelerate, because I think it's quite an important one, so we don't get too stifled as kind of B2B marketers, right?
Yeah, I think that's a goal of a lot of people. Seeing more bold moves in B2B marketing, I think would be great. My question on the back of that is, what is one advice that you have for people who want to take bolder moves in the B2B marketing space?
I'd say a couple things. I think one, never lose sight of first principles. I think it can be, as a marketer, whether B2B or B2C or B2B2C or whatever, permutation of letters you want to throw out, you're still fundamentally dealing with the core principles of marketing, and that it's about, all good marketing starts with good insight. You take that good insight, then you try and understand insight married with segmentation, then you try and figure out what's the most compelling story with that insight. Then you take that story, find the most efficient way to distribute that story to your audience. Then you measure, then you iterate. I think oftentimes, with all the new tooling and hype and buzz, we sometimes lose sight of that just simplicity and the first principles. And so, really you should be checking yourself at all levels just to make sure that you're doing your best to get the right insights, and you're doing your best to do the creative storytelling, and you're doing your best at the distribution, and you're measuring to the best of your ability. Granted, it's going to be imperfect, but at least you're, again, holding yourself accountable. So I think that's my major piece of advice. And then secondly, similar to what we spoke about earlier, just remember you're marketing to humans, right? There are enough white papers in the world. And, if you really want to connect with someone and you really want to build a relationship with someone, have someone listen to you and cut through, you need to treat them like a human, and you need to understand what makes them tick, and you need to meet them where they are. You can't expect them to come to you physically. You can't expect them to come to you from an interest level, because not everyone wakes up in the morning and the first thing to think about is financial infrastructure. So meet your audience where they are and understand how that might vary. Going back to those 4 truths across a brand, product, market, user, understand in your expansion markets how that will vary.
That's awesome, John. I got some rapid fire questions I want to shoot your way.
Let's do it.
First question I got is, what is one resource that has had a pretty profound impact on the way that you work or live?
Nudge. It's a book about behavioral economics, how people make choices, sometimes irrationally.
That's a great book. Second question is, if you could give one piece of advice to B2B marketers, what would it be?
Don't get trapped kind of trying to do the same playbook. You need to be bold. You need to cut through, because even taking a bit of a risk will be enough to differentiate your brand.
Who are some of the influencers you listen to and you follow quite closely?
I think there are kind of couple angles I take. I think in general, I'm more of a lover of kind of behavioral economics. So, when I think about kind of predictably irrational and a lot of the kind of commentary from Dan Ariely, I think that's one person I quite love reading. But even just a lot of kind of companies that are putting out just good practical knowledge. I mean, I've been a big fan of HubSpot's blog for a while. Granted, it's quite a massive blog, but I think they've kind of built their name on just how do you give just practical advice. Granted, it was, again, in service of SEO, but it's just really practical advice.
What is something that excites you about B2B today?
The possibility of what it can be.
Oof.
Like fundamentally, there's a lot of disruption that can happen. I think I've been through enough B2B conferences for the past several years, and a lot of the innovation that is marketed as innovation tends to be more or less the same thing every year. We're kind of making marginal gains when in reality, I think we can make transformational gains. And I think now's the time.
Jon, this has been an awesome conversation. I want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much again. And thank you so much for what you do as well to kind of inspire the marketing ecosystem overall. So much appreciated. Have a good rest of the day. Take care.